Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Raj Goyal, and I am very honored to be moderating this session. It's been an incredible day. I've been in and out, but every time I've been in, I keep saying, "My God, I shouldn't go out because I'm learning so much listening to everybody." A little bit of my background. We're going to let the panelists introduce themselves. I am the former board chair of Phi Borough, so I was honored after the passing of Dick Ravitch, Tom Allen, and Grace asked me to join. There's no way to fill his footsteps, but I joined about a year ago as the co-chair with Tom of Phi Borough. Obviously very excited about the merger into Citizens Union. I do happen to be a candidate for public office right now. I'm not talking about that today, but I've taken a pause from being on the board, but I was very involved in putting this together, so I'm very honored to be part of it. So if what we could do is we have an incredible panel, and I think it's just a perfect segue. And Grace, as usual, did a wonderful, and Emmy did this amazing job of the flow, because everything that everybody has said has come back to this notion of the business community. So now we have folks from the business community, and we can talk a little more practically about it. So if I just ask you to maybe give a quick minute of who you are and why you're here, and then we'll jump right in.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole DeSantis. I'm a partner with Boston Consulting Group. I work in our public sector and social impact practice areas, and I've led some research with BCG over the last several years around the topic of childcare, which I'll share more about today. I'm also a Texan, and there were some shots fired earlier about the Micron decision, so I'm just warning, I am a Texan. I'm not a New Yorker.
And I should ask, any kids?
No children.
No children. Got it. Good.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Raj, and congratulations on the launch of that campaign.
Sure.
That's very exciting. And Emmy and Grace, thank you so much to everyone at Five Boroughs for putting this together. It's really exciting to be here. I'm a little bit embarrassed because I'm sitting next to representatives from Accenture and Boston Consulting Group, and no one has heard of me, right? So that's a little bit embarrassing. But I'm the real estate guy, and so my name is Joseph Goodman. I have 2 children, with a third on the way. Although Dan Goldman with 5, I mean, that was a real flex. But I'm a real estate developer, really passionate about this subject, and really grateful to be here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Edie Sharp. I am a mom of 2 kids under 5. Raising them in New York City, the struggle is real. I'm with Accenture. I'm a managing director. I focus on public sector in supporting governments and taking care of tough challenges. And it's a little bit funny to think of myself as a business person because I spent 10 years with the city, with the previous Mayor de Blasio, at City Hall and at the Department of Education, where I was most recently the Chief of Staff and Chief Strategy Officer. And it's one of the highlights of my life that, with many others in this room, we worked on the policy proposal to expand pre-K and the implementation of it. So I get to wear both hats today.
Yeah. Well, thank you to the 3 of you very much. And so let's just kick off with everything I've heard from sort of the energy in the room, and the content, of course, has been this role of the business community. So we heard Ali from Vermont was talking very much about the critical role of, and then of course Julie was talking about how you put pressure within within a company, and here we are at Etsy and so on. I thought, if I could just kick this off, when Brad Lander talked about the idea that the private sector takes for granted these government payouts that help subsidize a bottom line, but yet it's not recognized by the private sector as such. And so this issue, let's be very candid, we're all here with a unified agenda, gets perceived as this kind of like, I need another government handout. And so it's a little bit of this, oh, well, the private sector, geez, you're just putting another unfunded mandate on us poor business people. And as Brad mentioned, but there's so much that actually goes into help a bottom line of a business. And one thing I omitted is I ran a technology company. I sold it, and so that's another reason I'm chairing this or moderating this panel. Is I know very well this pain of losing employees and trying to recruit them and so on. So maybe we could start with you on sort of like, how do we think about having the private sector? We always want the private sector to step up, but how does the private sector change its mindset to understand the benefits it's currently receiving, and therefore understand the ROI for a more comprehensive universal system?
Sure. So I'll attempt to speak to that on 2 levels, because BCG has done some of this research. One, we published several years ago, estimated that the U.S. nationally would lose $290 billion in GDP annually if it did not address issues in the caregiving crisis. Now, that number is huge and it does not feel directly applicable to a business leader, though business leaders did read that and they were shocked by it. And of course, BCG works with many business leaders. Later down the road, we decided to do some research that made it feel a little bit more practical and tangible to specific businesses. So I think Allie kind of mentioned this earlier, but it's like take something big, which feels sort of unrelatable. It is true and it is a big number, and those are the impacts that we're going to see, but bringing it a little bit smaller scale. So we worked with 5 companies, Etsy being one of them, to study the specific impacts of offering childcare benefits. So, and that was asking employees specific questions about the benefits that their company offered them. So, when the company was investing directly in their workforce, could be on-site childcare, could be backup care, could be stipends. And what we saw consistently across the 5 companies, all different industries, all different sizes, different locations, was that there was a positive return on investment between 90% and 425%. So pretty meaningful outcome. The thing that really compelled me was not that big ROI number, which I do believe is accurate, but that you could cover the cost of providing the benefits by retaining only 1 to 12% of your eligible employees. So that means that you're breaking even just by retaining a small percentage of your employees by offering these childcare benefits. That's pretty easy to grip onto as a company leader. That feels very practical and tangible. The other thing that was interesting is we saw that up to 13 days of work were being missed due to childcare related issues that could be solved if you had better access. That's also very tangible. That's nearly 3 weeks of working days that you're missing as an employee, and employers can notice that. And we also saw some of the intangible effects. So that's, what is the impact on retention or productivity? That's pretty easy to quantify from an economic perspective. But we also saw upwards of 80% of people saying, this is the reason or one of the main reasons I stayed at my employer was that I had access to these benefits. Or nearly 75% said, this had an impact on my career. I was able to advance further in my career because of the provision of these benefits. Unfortunately, I think it's something like 12% of employees in the US have access to some type of childcare benefits. And so we can see these positive impacts, but they're not necessarily where they need to be today.
Fascinating. Joseph, you had a feature article in the New York Times. I believe Eliza wrote it, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm not sure she's still
Yes,
here, but I
yeah,
really need
yeah.
to thank her.
Right. That talked about you're a real estate developer, a prominent one, and talk to us about what was that project and
Sure.
why did you do that? It was very groundbreaking.
So I've been approaching this issue not so much as an employer, right? But I'm thinking about it from the perspective of tenants and future tenants, and also from our neighborhoods. Because my job as a developer, and I love what Ali Richards said about, coach, put me in. Like developers and real estate actors, I think, have to do a much better job at raising our hands and saying we can be your partners in all realms of public policy, whether it's transit, infrastructure, energy, education, childcare. Coach, put us in. Right? Because we really think, or I believe, that developers can be that really important linchpin.
I'm going to rudely interrupt to ask, are
Please.
you an outlier, or a lot of business folks I know are like, Coach, get me the hell away from that game. Dirty, smelly, and I want to I want to make some money.
Well, I think that's a good question. Am I an outlier? I think the reality is that unless developers and members of the real estate community raise their hand, they're not going to be at the table. And when they're not at the table, then they'll have that perspective, right? Then they'll feel like, oh, we got passed over, we got left out. It's because you didn't raise your hand. It's because you didn't demonstrate to your community, to your neighbors, that you actually could be the solution here. And if I'm able as a developer to provide you with solutions, then you'll allow me to build in your neighborhoods, right? You'll call me back, you'll embrace me, and you won't be skeptical, right? So in Harlem, for example, we built a daycare up on 146th Street and Frederick Douglass Boulevard with 15 students. We're actually building our second daycare on 126th Street and Madison Avenue. We'll be building a third daycare.
Inside one of your developments.
So 2 will be inside and 1 will be outside. But the point being that, we want to be building in this community. We want to be building housing, right? So we'll talk about housing and childcare as the biggest expenses in a typical New York City family's life, right? So how could you not have developers there at the center tackling both of those issues at the same time? But if I can show you, and if I can demonstrate to to these neighborhoods that I'm here building out these schools, right? Then they'll allow me to build, and then it's like a virtuous cycle, right? And that's what, not as an employer, I want to be doing, but it's as a builder, right? And that's, that's what I'm getting at.
Edie, a wealth of experience in the public sector, as you mentioned. So, as you said, you're now in the private sector. You're not operating a business, but you're in the private sector. So, give us your take on this fundamental question here of how the private sector philosophically sees itself and how it needs to, get in the game.
Yeah, and I think I'll go back to the experience of 2014 and maybe even before that in 2012. I think that there's this tendency in the discourse, especially in a very politicized environment that we're in, that there's these expansionary policies that tend to be kind of emblematic of like the radical left. And when you have the business sector step forward and play an advocacy role to really help defang that, to make the argument that this is important for our employees, it helps to advance an agenda that otherwise might not be possible. And I think that that was something that was certainly true when we talked about the expansion of pre-K and 3K. It was a big political lift to get that across the board. And, there was a reason that in 2012, then candidate de Blasio went and announced his intention to do this at the Abney breakfast. Like he knew and he recognized that this was a big tent effort that needed everybody at the table to advance it. Go 2 years later in 2014, business leaders and others were, at the forefront of writing op-eds, of calling their elected officials, of really putting their shoulder to the wheel to get this done. So I think just like one of the dimensions of the policy and advocacy intersection is to help to depoliticize this and ensure that this is part of the articulation of what the city needs, all of us need.
Fascinating. So, as we've been saying, this notion of the business community as political actor is really at the core of this. And one thing Kathy Wild, told me a couple of years ago that really struck home is that, in fact, I'll just say quickly, I'm sort of living this in my other day job, which is there are actually, SEC rules that prevent people in the political class. They seek campaign contributions, and that's a lot of like interaction. Well, for state and local, it's often not allowed for folks, particularly let's say on Wall Street, to give. And that's a whole policy and that's a whole other debate. But what she had mentioned is that the connectivity between state and local electeds and policymakers and the business community has actually broken down over time because there's just not a lot of stickiness. And so, how do you feel, any one of you, how do you just feel about the notion of the necessity for elected officials and policymakers to interact more with the business community as a general matter? One of the reasons when Five Boroughs started is I think there was a notion that there was a dearth of that those ties had kind of frayed. So I'd love to have you comment on that.
I mean, these big ambitious goals that the city has like only happen if we're all rowing in the same direction. And there's a role for everybody in this room to contribute to expansion of childcare. There is a role for everybody to play in the expansion of universal pre-K. I think we need to think about the skills that we all have that can help to complement the gaps that may exist in government, and also to recognize that government is actually the expert in the room. They have a clear sense of what's needed with a sense of urgency and universality to it to push the focus and to really hone the attention that where we can all move in the same direction. I think it's really important. And when we have these moments where the governor's putting it forward in her agenda, the likely mayor has made this a central point, it makes it easier for real estate to come to the table to say, okay, there's a clear focus, I have a place to plug in, you have a team that's focused on it, let's move. The speed and the urgency and the universality of these are the ways that you get these big things done.
And I think it's important for people within childcare to look at other policy arenas and say, oh, in that space, public and private really came together. So, for example, I think about Mayor Bloomberg, his administration, when it came to the Fresh program. You familiar with that? Where they tried to build out more, grocery grocery change and food stores, food access in neighborhoods which didn't have. And so they developed this program called the Fresh program, and they said to developers, if you anchor your multifamily projects with a grocery store, right, we will give you a zoning bump, right? So we'll incentivize you. So if you take an incentive program like that and you tell to developers and builders, if you now anchor your housing projects with a daycare, we will give you a density bump, right? We will, then you're creating a real economic incentive for developers and for landlords to be building out these daycare centers and helping make it more affordable. So I think looking at analogs and other examples is a really good way to get the public and private working together on this issue.
I would just add that I think sometimes the business community can be more skeptical quietly than they are in conversations when they're sitting down with public leaders and with advocates. They can believe that there's something good in what is being said and they kind of agree, or they think maybe that's a good idea down the road. But until you make it really tangible for them and how it affects their business and their environment specifically, I think you might be getting a half-hearted yes of support from the business community. So I would encourage the business community to ask tough questions about what the real impact will be of expanded access to childcare. And then for the philanthropic community, advocacy community, and public officials to have good responses to those questions and make it feel very specific to the businesses that you're trying to get on board. I think sometimes there's we like to be on the same page and we're semi-committed to it, but until you make it feel really clear what the value is to the business itself, I think you might get a half-hearted yes.
And I think when you start to kick into gear, right? When you start doing implementation, that's when you can surface the areas of complementary support. And I think that's the moment that we're in. You have to dive into this and make it happen to surface the ways in which, places like BCG or Accenture can do the complex project management support that might get something off the ground, or real estate might be able to find the places for child care centers. I think getting tactical is really, really important.
Or employers saying, this is what we will contribute along the path to more universality.
Right.
Like, we believe that this is useful and we will put our own dollars into it, but we need to believe that it's really useful to us. Of course, it impacts the environment, the community as a whole, but I think making that case specifically to business leaders continues to be very important.
I'd like to get back to let's call it the lander point, which is, what do you think it would take for the private sector to actually, I'm thinking just off the top of my head, and please, anyone correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think I've ever seen a calculator or a report or a soundbite on how much government programs are helping a private sector company offload cost on the books. And, I'll never forget the sticker shock when we had to get health insurance for our employees. I was like, what the hell is this? I mean, it was like, first of all, it was a blizzard of complexity. Totally, I was just trying to get revenue. I mean, it just seemed like a complete mess. But it opened my eyes when I realized, yeah, well, of course, there's a whole raft of governmental systems that are helping me. So question is, what do you think it would take, and is it even worth that, climbing that mountain to start explaining to the private sector that there's actually ROI you're already getting from existing successful government programs, to Edie's point, and therefore that's credibility to get more? Joseph, you want to start? Or go Nicole?
I think there's value in this, certainly. Also, we tried to do a version of this actually on the, if you all know Moms First, we have a calculator and a tool for a company to self-evaluate on the return on investment from offering childcare benefits. That doesn't go so far as to say, and in your community, you all also have access to these government structures and systems of support, and therefore what's the return on investment from that. I think that's a very interesting point, though. I don't know that naturally a company might think of that as part of the calculation.
No, and I think that the comptroller's point was a compelling one because he wasn't talking about broadly, right? He was talking about something specific, which is the expansion of something that didn't exist before, that had an immediate benefit for families, that was pre-K and 3K. And that is the model that we're talking about expanding down. It's not just a general kind of open-ended, how does government support all of us collectively? There's something very real here that happened in the city that has made a difference for my family. It's made a difference for many families in this room, and we should be clear about that. We should make that something that is a shared and sustained commitment. I think the point that was made in the last panel that Ali made about keeping business in through implementation is a good one. And then also through impact, right? Like 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, 20 years down the line.
Yeah, I mean, I think, real estate has a vested interest in all of this working, right? If this doesn't work, then people will leave the city the way that they currently are leaving the city, and then the city is not growing. And if the city is not growing, well, then we have problem filling our buildings, right? We have problem with turnover and retention. We want a growing, prosperous city because that's our business, right? And we need to constantly be pushing things forward to make this a more affordable, sustainable, prosperous city because then we just have no one wants a half-empty building.
Well, actually, if I could turn to you, Joseph, on that point, because there is, I think, sort of looming, there's this elephant in the room post-COVID, which is, I think I'm sure maybe the government mentioned it, but everyone's seeing these stories. Oh my gosh, the financial sector doesn't need to be in New York anymore. That perception is now becoming. You saw that big story on Y'all Street, Dallas, which is beyond. Sorry, but yeah, I'm originally from Kansas, so but how is there a sort of a fissure coming? Because one used to think of the business community sort of unified. Wall Street, real estate, obviously tech in the last 20 years. But what you're saying, to be honest, sounds a little bit at odds with maybe what a bank CEO might say, because a bank CEO is saying, hell, it's just like it's 60 cents on the buck to like move them to Irving, Texas, or to move them to the Philippines or whomever. But you can't move a building. You only thrive in New York City. Your vested interest in New York City is qualitatively different than perhaps another, private sector CEO. So how do you think about that?
But the talent is here, right? So they'll have a real issue locating the same talent in, where did you say, Wichita, was it? I'm just joking.
I said Irving, which is,
Irving, I just
which
heard
is,
Wichita.
yeah.
But they'll have a real problem with talent over there, right?
Yeah.
The talent wants to be here. And we spoke earlier about how that population continues to grow here, but it's the 30s and 40-year-olds who find themselves pushed out, right? So employers, they want to be here. Because of the talent, right, and because those grad students, they want to come, and it's really about capturing the people and making sure that the 30s and 40-year-olds are staying here. The 20s, that's not the problem,
Right.
and that's why.
Sex in the City is alive and well.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Edie, you want to weigh in on that?
I mean, I'm thinking as a parent, like, do any of us want to live in a city where children aren't there? I mean, none of us do. So it's about something a little bit more fundamental about what makes a city work, what makes places the places you want to be, that make them rich places, multi-generational places. I can't speak on, from the perspective of a CEO and their bottom line, but I can speak as a member, as a resident of the city and someone who is raising my family here for a reason, and who I think my employers have sought to keep because of everything that New York City can give to them as an engine of the economy.
Nicole, can you tell us a little bit more about your report in terms of like where did that come from? Are there more like where was the energy for that? And did it accomplish your goals in breaking through and all of that?
So luckily it had very wide reach, this report on ROI. I think it's because while there has been a lot of studying done on the impact of childcare broadly on communities, it hadn't necessarily gotten to the place of saying, but what is the specific impact on companies? And I think that that's why it was so widely read and shared. BCG has been committed to the topic of childcare for many years and will continue to do research and publish reports similar to this one. I think there's more work to be done to, again, quantify what the impact is to the organizations with leaders who do have a strong voice in helping push forward public provision as well.
Yeah. Any concluding thoughts here? We'll as we wrap up.
I mean, I think that one of the things that is a factor here that we should just talk about is that another role that the business community can play is talking to their own people about getting kids into these programs as well. So when there is this kind of expansionary moment, when you're creating new seats and new capacity, it's not enough. I think, as many of us heard over and over again, it's not enough to just like, if you build it, they will come. Like, we as employers, we as big employers also have to ensure our families know that these benefits exist, that hopefully if we can get to expansive and universal childcare, that our employees are sending their kids there, and that we're a part of the effort to do the outreach to get the supply and the demand cycle going, so that we can kind of start to untangle what is very complicated systemic problems that make this a really, really hard problem to solve.
Yeah, I'll just end off by saying I'm very optimistic for this issue. I think this is clearly one of those very few bipartisan issues, right, that really unites both sides, all sides of the spectrum. And I'm especially optimistic because in New York City, you just have tons of resources. You have tons of talent. And with the resources and talents that we have here, a la congestion, right? We were the first big city to make congestion pricing. We can certainly be the first big city to improve the situation here. And I think over the next 5 years, given all the energy in this room and the political momentum, Rebecca Balin's important work, all that stuff, that the pendulum is clearly swinging. And when you match momentum with resources, you get outcome.
All my jokes about being from Texas aside, I do think you all have enormous momentum and capacity in New York City to be a first mover or a second mover to New Mexico in pushing this forward. So I also feel very optimistic, and I'm excited to see what happens here.
I'll only conclude by saying, obviously this is hosted by 5 borough, but in the ideal world, this is a New York statewide, program. And obviously there's historical, I wouldn't say tension, but divide between maybe the city and the rest of the state. But I'll just end it on an even more hopeful note, which is I think there's such momentum right now that it is certainly not a foregone conclusion by any means, but that New York City feels like it's in grasp. But I actually think to have a state, New Mexico is great, but to have a state as huge and complex and as rich and as varied as New York State, I played a small role on this cell phone ban in schools. It was a much easier issue than childcare, but you see, like, everybody said that couldn't be done. Oh, it's too much. City schools, upstate schools, suburban schools, anything can be done. So we'll leave it on that optimistic note. Thanks, the panelists, please. So that was really terrific. Thank you.